Alrighty, we are recording here. I'm very thankful and grateful to be here with Tim Gabbett and Scott Willgress. Tim, how are you first this morning in your time zone?
Yeah, very well, Dave. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. You're a fan favorite on the podcast. The first episode was a top 10 download, so you should be honored.
Yeah, I mean, that was a lot of fun. It was on the back of 2 pretty solid days in New York, and it was a good workshop. So it was a good way to finish that workshop. Actually, talking more about training load.
You get the gold star award because I twisted your arm. You agreed to it. I wish I'd agreed to it the Saturday night or maybe the day before you had it, because I felt so bad. You were exhausted the entire time, and you're like, yeah, I'll do it. And I was like, wow, man, this guy's a trooper.
Well, it's kind of test. It really tests how well you know your stuff when you're fatigued or when you're hungover or you're drunk and someone's asking you about training load.
All right, third podcast. I'm going to tie you to that.
We'll do that next time. We'll just check how well he actually knows his stuff.
But no, very, very well received. People, not only just in gymnastics, but people around the world were very happy about us talking about some like the youth sports side of things and the stress side of things. So I thank you a lot for that. And I think this one will be equally as valuable. And we're also joined by quick returner, Scott Willgress, strength and conditioning coach from Halifax, Canada. Scott, how are you?
I'm doing great, Dave. Thanks for having me on, and it's honestly an honor to be on here with the great Tim Gabbett.
I know. We're not worthy, Tim. We're not worthy.
There's a few Tim Gabbetts out there, and it's not very often that he's called great. So it just depends which Tim Gabbett you're talking to, Scott.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we get deep enough into the weeds, who knows what could come up in this podcast.
Ruin Tim's career in an hour on a podcast.
Everyone has skeletons in their closet.
Oh man, yeah. So Scott's episode was extremely popular as well, kicking off kind of like his work with Ellie Black and some other people, and kind of opened the door a lot to a conversation about strength and conditioning for gymnastics in a traditional way. But Scott and I actually have kind of a side project or passion around workloads. And it's funny the way this all worked out is Tim was the person who helped me build the workload system that I kind of was testing here in the States. And we got halfway through and then COVID exploded. And then it's somehow, ironically, through you, Scott, kind of we're using very similar things, whether you got it passed through somebody else to you or you had your own genius ideas. And what you were showing me was like 2.0 of what I was thinking. So we're dancing around the same issues here in gymnastics. And I think the goal here with this podcast is twofold. One is to maybe dig into some of Tim's brain that's a little bit more than the surface layer deep. I think people are familiar with workloads. They understand the basics. We kind of know what's going on. So maybe getting a couple more complexity layers down there, but then also just talking about what gymnastics can probably do moving forward. As we all know, we're in a rough patch here. And I think wellness and workloads is a really important part to our future. So I'm excited to have you guys both on. And anytime you guys have things that you want to throw in, just dive in and feel free. It's a pretty open conversation. And I think the first way to start is, Tim, I kind of took your course 2 years ago, and I had done my homework beforehand. I'd read a lot of your work and stuff, and I went to the course with an open mind, and I learned a lot from the course, even more so. But I feel as though everyone kind of understands now monitoring is important, basic workloads are important, and I feel as though it's being used a lot. But I feel like a lot of people are maybe putting words in your mouth sometimes, or maybe they're misapplying something. So I'm curious to kind of know both of your thoughts, Tim, from your side about what maybe you see are some of the misconceptions, and then Scott, maybe what your thoughts are on where strength coaches might kind of steer the boat the wrong way. So Tim, what are your thoughts on that initially?
Well, look, I think if we go back to say 2016 is probably when most people started to follow it a little bit more. It's not as though it was new at that stage, but certainly this concept of the acute chronic workload ratio was relatively new at that point in terms of looking at injury risk. There's a similar version of it for endurance sports, training stress balance, that have been used by Andy Coggan for a long time and is implemented in a lot of different monitoring platforms, but particularly in Training Peaks. I think probably from that point, two things happened. One, people became more aware of how training load is important in developing robustness and developing resilience in athletes, and that it's not it's not this negative thing that we should be fearful of. We need to be respectful of it, but we don't need to be fearful of it. You know, it's like any stress. If you can push towards it, then, you know, the more often you expose yourself to a certain type of stress with adequate recovery in between, the more likely that you are going to be able to deal with it when you have to face it. So that was one thing. But the second thing, I think a lot of people latched on to the colourful graph and said, oh, well, okay, well, I know everything I need to know about training load now. And from that point, you know, I've seen a lot of people set up straw man arguments but pretend that they're my straw man. You know, so I think that's probably a really key point, that if you take the time to actually read the paper, if you take the time, I mean, the biggest hint is in the title. Should our athletes be training smarter and harder? You know, so the concept is not manage your athletes in cotton wool. It's not manage your athletes away from load. It's not restrict the amount of training. It's actually, if we can push towards that stress early in rehab, when we're dealing with athletes at higher levels, if we can move towards that stress in a sensible way, then we give our athletes a chance of competing on a big stage. And if I had one message that I wanted people to take away back then that hasn't changed at all over the 5 years since that point, and even the time before that, is that training hard is a good thing. You know, we need to train hard, and if you want to get to high level performances, there's no easy way to get there. You could be lucky once, but if you want to do it on a consistent basis, then you have to have consistency in your training. That doesn't mean that you train constantly and that you never rest, because you need the recovery periods to adapt. But training hard is the stimulus that actually allows you to get to those high performances. There's no easy way to get there.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I think kind of splintering off of that, I feel as though one common mistake that there's two common mistakes. One I had was that it's all about the number. And that was the first thing you said in the lecture courses. Obviously, I saw you as kind of like the research guy. So I was coming into the course thinking this is going to be a numbers statistician thing. And the first thing you said is like, the most important thing is talking to the athlete and seeing how they feel and having an open dialogue, not just staring at your spreadsheet and changing the workout based on that. So I think that is very important for people to understand. But two is that I think the sport specific workload and also the general training workload are both equally valued here. And I think people here train smarter, train harder. They think play your sport more. They think just do more of the sport itself. And that's personally where I actually think we hit the wheels on some big speed bumps, because people just do the same thing over and over again, not realizing there's a lot of opportunity to build capacity and build workload without just throwing a baseball or without jumping or running or doing gymnastics. And so I guess before I pass it to Scott, what are your thoughts on those two things, the number and then maybe the differences between the two types of workloads?
Well, in terms of the number, I mean, again, there is no magic number. I can tell you on average that, you know, when you rapidly change workloads, when you spike someone's training load, the risk of injury will increase on average. But I can't tell you with any real certainty which one of those athletes are going to break. I might have an idea based on some background variables, some moderators, strength and aerobic fitness and age and previous injury history, but to say that I can predict injuries is incorrect. I can't predict injuries with any real accuracy. So the number itself it just gives you an indication of the load that you've done relative to what you've prepared for. And that's probably a key point, that when we load, you can load in a lot of different ways, but do you want to just take this load and see how you feel, apply any load and see how you feel, or do you want to consider the capacity of the athlete when you load? Now, the second point is, I think, around
sport specific versus general capacity training.
Yeah, look, I think I think there's probably the term I would use is local tissue capacity. So if we're in rehab, our emphasis is generally on local tissue capacity. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do sport-specific capacity training, because if we don't do that and we heal the tissue, we rehab it really well with improved local tissue capacity, there's still a massive gap between what gets done in rehab and what needs to be done as part of the sport. So wherever possible, when you have someone in rehab, you want to be doing touches, reminders of general capacity or sport-specific capacity, along with your local tissue loading. That way we start to bridge the gap between what happens in rehab and what needs to be done in peak performance.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And speaking from the medical provider point of view, that's probably the biggest error that I see. And I think that Champion has done a really good job at doing is we're not afraid to push people in rehab, especially towards the end, to be really, really hard. I mean, the two patients I just worked with that were gymnasts, they were both drenched in sweat, right? They both have pretty significant injuries, but there's still a way to find a trainable menu, as Tony Gennacore says. Like, there's a way to train and build capacity. I think there's some great research from the AIS that says the more you can maintain that workload when they're out of their sport, the better off they're going to be down the road. So I think that oftentimes the medical providers, because maybe they don't have a strength and conditioning background, leave them quite a bit short of what they could do. And it's a huge jump to go back to the beginning of the rehab process. So we can definitely, I'd love to dive into that more in a sec. But Scott, what are your thoughts? What do you think, maybe as you're someone who's definitely well experienced in this and you've used it with national level athletes and also kind of some mid-level athletes, what do you think are the biggest kind of wrong turns that people take in terms of applying some of this stuff?
Well, so far it's been awesome listening to you guys chat about it, and I don't want to necessarily beat a dead horse, I guess, and just recount what you guys have said, but definitely the biggest one is trying to use those numbers as absolutes, like black and white. You're either in the sweet spot, or you're training too much, or you're training too little. And Tim, I really liked when you talked about the moderators, like without taking into consideration things like previous injury or strength levels, aerobic fitness levels, all that sort of stuff. I think that if practitioners or coaches are just looking for a number, you're going to miss out on some really good training if you don't kind of give those people credit for maybe having really high strength levels, really high aerobic fitness, and a limited injury history. So I think those are some things that strength coaches might get a little too excited about the numbers right off the bat. And then I think the other one, and we've also sort of touched on this a little bit, I think, but a colleague of mine who you guys both might know, Jeremy Shepard from he now works at the Canadian Institute, Sport Institute Pacific with snowboarding, freestyle snowboarding. But he's talking a lot about not just an overall global acute to chronic workload ratio, but more of a training type specific ratio. So or at least number or understanding of what's going on in different types of trainings, plyometric training, strength training, aerobic or cardiovascular type training. These types of things, obviously have a different stimulus and stress different systems of the body. So having an understanding of the training load that's going on in all those different areas, I think is also really important and often not really looked at.
Yeah. And I think the last thing to button this up too is like, there's nobody having these type of conversations between a sports scientist, a strength conditioning coach, a doctor, a physical therapist. Like, it's very hard to get everybody on the same page. And I think you often put the athlete in the middle of a crossfire, and sometimes you're getting pulled in a couple different directions, So yeah, it's interesting, Tim, that I think we're starting to talk about the tissue capacity stuff when you were here in Boston, kind of teaching the course again. And I feel as though the literature is going to start moving there, because I think we know like failure rates of things like UCL ligaments, and the ACL is probably the most frequent play. Hamstring strains and the ACL where we tried to play the most with applying some of the stuff from the course. And it's interesting because there's a way to build local tissue capacity, as you say, and still try to maintain or build workload around that injury. And I think if people could take one thing away from the podcast so far, is that there's a way to build your joint specific stuff or your ligament specific stuff with like great work we have from other researchers like Mike and Lenny and stuff. They know that stuff, but there's a lot of work to still be done around the injury. And I think people really, unfortunately, leave a lot on the table there. And so have you had more development in terms of like the injury type rehab stuff, or is that still kind of something you're leaving to the medical providers to sort out?
Well, yeah, firstly, there is a massive gap there around loading for specific tissue types. And we generally can use the key training principles to load specific tissues, and in general, the training principles are going to hold up. But yeah, there's a gap there, and we're starting to work on little pieces of the puzzle there. So, we're working on some projects looking at loading and how that can impact on pain in people with chronic pain. But there's a really cool paper that it's a case report of one soccer player, and it was recently published in, I think it's the International Journal of Sports Physical Therapy.
Yeah.
And they looked at loading in following an ACL injury, and they had a series of criteria-based milestones, if you like. So, and they hit all of those milestones. They were pretty close to hitting them, as they planned to hit them. They tracked things like step count and jumps and active minutes of training, so right throughout the rehab. And you can see that the progression in loading was really, really good. But one of their key findings was that when they compared the demands of rehab to the demands of competition, the average demands of competition, that the athlete was around 30% lower than the average demands of competition. So what that means is that athlete has done really well in rehab, but is still below the average demands of competition. Now, if they're below the average demands of competition, they're going to be a mile away from the most demanding passage of play. So when we talk about recurrent injuries, this is one area I think that we need to consider is at some point in time, from when you're cleared to return to the sport, some point before then, you want to be exposed to the demands of competition, whether at least the average, but more than likely, you want to have some exposure to what the most demanding of passage of play looks like.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think this is kind of, in my mind, I see the next frontier of where this stuff is going to go. Is I feel as though it's challenging sometimes. We're lucky that we have an out-of-network providership. We can spend an hour and a half with somebody and do all they need. But it's rare that the average rehab provider can do, a 60-minute session where they're really getting after it and they're kind of putting so much demand on the athlete and fatiguing them. Because as you say, VO2 max is one of the biggest things we have here to understand, risk factors. And I think that this is where the partnership between strength and conditioning and physical therapy or athletic trainers or whoever else it is I think that the medical provider has the role of stressing the tissue, how they know in a controlled environment with the variables such as power or max strength or max velocity. Like that, I think is very much in the wheelhouse of a medical provider to stress those things. Like if you understand baseball or gymnastics or sprinting, you can build a pretty good dosage program there and be like, all right, we go take people out. It's like, I want to see you max effort 20 meters. Let's spend half our session getting a good warm up and doing everything right. Let's do some max effort 20s, some 50s, some 100s. And it's really opened the wheelhouse here because if you get tweaked or hurt, I want it to be right in front of me and I want to know what's going on. But that being said, this is kind of where I'll pass it to Scott is I think that the strength and conditioning world has much more flexibility to really build a comprehensive, exhausting quote unquote program where it maybe mimics the demands of their sport more. So whether they're actually doing 30 minutes of continuous, half-sided games as they do in soccer or elsewhere. And without those two things, without a medical provider maxing out their ability at the right time to show athletic qualities that stress the tissue and strength conditioning professionals to help them max out their general capacities, how in the world do we know that they're ready to go back to even partial practice? And I think that's like a very elephant in the room topic is that I think a lot of people are still guessing. I'm like, well, let's try practice. How many days? I don't know, 3 days. Well, how much they should do? I don't know, just try some turns. Like it's not a good solution. You know what I mean? So I don't know, Scott, what do you think on that? I've never really talked about that, but what are your thoughts on like the global stress side of trying to get everybody max?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really, really important topic. And, I'm actually going through a situation right now with on the softball side with one of the other Canadian national teams I work with, where we're having an athlete who's coming back from a bit of a strain in her lower back. And, between myself, who's usually in Halifax, although I have been in BC for a little while with another team, and our athletic therapist who's based out of BC, and then the athlete who's currently in Florida. There's lots of like back and forth and these, videos that we're sending around and training ideas between the athletic therapy side and myself that we're then bouncing off the athlete to give it a try, send us some video. How does it look? How does it feel? Should we go down this road? Should we, back off a little bit? Because I mean, I guess in a way we have a bit of a gift of some more time than we usually would. But at the same time, when the athlete finally does come together with the team, it's going to be go time, right? It's going to be like, you have to make the team in basically a 2-week window, or at least make it past the first set of cuts, because, time is of the essence once the team gets together. So yeah, I think it's that sort of balancing game between pushing the envelope and doing it safely, and then and also making sure that we're understanding what's going on with the recovery level and how that athlete's doing. So yeah, it's definitely a balancing act. It's something that's really important to be doing.
Yeah, and it's also, I think the thing that always pops into my head as a medical provider, but also as a coach, as I work with athletes, I'm always wondering what they're going to look like in a fatigued state. You know what I mean? Like, not many injuries or problems come up when someone's fresh and ready to go. It's in the half to 3/4 of their workloads that we're worried about. So, you can think about that as acute metabolic fatigue in the course of some sort of set or session, but also just global fatigue in terms of how do you look 3 to 5 weeks into your really hard training programs. And we're pretty adamant that you should periodize your rehab programs in the same way you would a strength program, because I want someone to get to the 3rd, 4th week of an ACL 6 to 9 month rehab and really be kind of like in the tank a little bit. And I still want to see what's going to happen. So I know, Tim, can you share some thoughts on the role of maybe fatigue and injury risk? I guess I'm not as up currently on what those literature studies say.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably two schools of thought there. If you look at the reviews that have been done on fatigue and injury risk, the research would say that there's no evidence to say that fatigue contributes to injuries. Now, anyone who works in sport as a clinician or perhaps an athlete might have a different idea on that. So our clinical judgment probably doesn't necessarily weigh up or marry up with the research evidence. And this is a really good example of when we talk about evidence-based practice, that you could be a person who just thinks evidence-based practice is just about using the research, and if the research doesn't exist, then what does that mean for you? Does it mean you can't help your athlete? If there's a particular area that hasn't really been studied or has differential results, that some would say yes it does, some say it doesn't. Does that mean that you can't use the research? Well, the reality is, when we use evidence-based practice, we use the best available research, but we also use our clinical experience, and we also depend on the athlete's beliefs and values. So if you have an athlete, if you have a belief, that you see that this athlete tends to break down in the 3rd and 4th quarter of the games, or the athlete has this belief that he doesn't have the resilience when he gets a bit fatigued, then you've got to work with the athlete on that. And so in some respects, you don't throw out the research. You still balance that out with your clinical experience, but you also need to take into account those 3 parts: the research evidence, your clinical experience, and the athlete's values. And that's where when you join that up, that's when you get closer to using really good evidence-based practice. It's not just using research on its own. So do I personally believe that the fatigue contributes to injuries? Well, even though the research may not show it, it's pretty hard to actually do a controlled research study on that. So that's probably why the evidence doesn't support it. Not that it doesn't exist. It's just that it's really hard to study. And do I think it happens? Yeah, I do. I think some athletes will handle fatigue better than others. And some athletes will break down in the front end of games because the intensity of the game is so high. Sure. So it varies probably from athlete to athlete. But yeah, I think fatigue probably does play a role.
Yeah, Scott, what are your thoughts on that? Your insights?
I mean, yeah, like I guess I think about it a little bit more from a chronic fatigue standpoint. Like, at the end of long training cycles, at the end of seasons, when athletes are more susceptible to breakdown. That's really what I've kind of seen in my experience. I mean, I really liked what Tim was saying along the lines of, evidence-based doesn't necessarily just mean what the research says, because again, research is usually behind what's happening in the field, right? Whether that's the field, especially a field like strength and conditioning that's relatively new, right? Like in the grand scheme of fields in sports science, S&C is pretty new. We're really figuring stuff out as we go. And I think, there's lots of really good research in the field. There's lots of information to suggest, maybe building up work capacity or things like that is going to be protective against injuries, but we don't really know. So I think you kind of use what you've seen and what you've seen work, and you kind of go from there. You build your own body of evidence in a lot of ways, and as long as you're collecting information, collecting data in a sound way, that you're sure that what you're seeing is real, and then you can start to share that stuff in the form of peer-to-peer conversation or case study type things, poster presentation. Those types of things can be super useful, even though it might not be research grade, based on small sample sizes or things like that. But I think that's kind of the world that we live in high performance sport. The sample sizes are small by nature. There's only so many people that compete at the top level of the sport in their country or the world, for that matter. So you're not going to get 1,000 person, an N of 1,000, when we're dealing with high performance athletes.
Yeah. And I think this is a really great transition to kind of what I was hoping to make a big chunk of this podcast about, is something that I learned from Tim's course that was the most valuable to me. And that I think the paper just came out maybe last year. Tim was like the concepts of floors and ceilings and the time intervals. And because that's what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about whether you're a very high level sport athlete or whether you're someone who's just trying to get by and enjoy your sport as you come in your career, you're always against the clock, right? There's always a competitive season you're trying to race against. And it feels as though there's a tug of war between whether someone's hurt or not. A coach might want more time and to ramp up faster, whereas a medical provider might say, hey, we got to hold back tissue capacity, can't handle this fast ramp up. And we start to have some little like tug of wars here, or like kind of headbutting between how much can we get out of an athlete in preseason? Do they want to do the work of preseason so that we can kind of build things up? So I guess before we dive into that, Tim, can you just briefly overview kind of what those concepts kind of allude to?
Yeah, I mean, look, the floor, the ceiling, and time. The floor and the ceiling, as you say, they're just concepts. But this whole conversation is around those concepts. So the floor is I call it the athlete's current capacity. Now that could be local tissue capacity, or it could be sport specific capacity. And then the ceiling is the capacity that is required when you have to go to the sport or the activity that you need to perform. And then obviously time is just the time that you have to get from point A to point B, to get from the floor to the ceiling and get your athletes there in one piece. And you're absolutely right. Our biggest enemy in sport, or in a lot of different environments, whether it be military or the arts, is time. We always want one more week, or we want just give me one more week with it, coach. And well, we can't have one more week because the Super Bowl is next week, and after that we don't have a game. So the idea there is how can we use that information to safely build our athletes to the ceiling. We want them to be able to perform the demands of the ceiling, at the ceiling, or if possible, even raise that ceiling, so they have a higher capacity. They're better able to cope with what the game throws at them. And what we know that when you ramp up loads really quickly, that the risk of injury goes up. That's a really common finding. But we've just put out some stuff recently. This year, it's come out that if you ramp up loads really quickly, it also decreases your performance potential. So your readiness to perform decreases. And funnily enough, when you can build to higher chronic loads are associated with better performance potential. So it's kind of flipping the script or changing the narrative from risk to resilience. That if you can build up safely, not only are you going to have your athletes, more of your athletes available to play, but when they do play or when they are training, they're going to be ready for it.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And that was where my mind first went when we were kind of having this conversation. But like fatigue and what I learned from the course is like what I see clinically in terms of what causes like a large tissue damage is when somebody doesn't really have a good plan for that entire mapping up. And they also they go to a national team camp or they go to some big competition and they just get like triple the workload thrown at them that they're not ready for, because it's just like all at once. They want a lot. They want to see what the athletes have. They want to capacity wise. So they kind of have this individual plan. They go to a training camp and they go and it like spikes up to the ceiling, and they actually don't get hurt at the training camp. But 2 weeks after, the week after, they go home, they go, oh my God, I feel terrible. And they're coming to me after they have these big events where it's like, well, it wasn't the camp's fault, but we know that maybe there's a delayed onset with some of these issues. And so I think that's what people need to really take to heart is you need to really have a good understanding of what your big chunks are of the season. And the hourglass analogy that my mentor, Mike Reinhold, has told me has helped me a lot. That's what they do in pro baseball is like, we either can put more sand in the hourglass as we move into the preseason and off season, or we can slow the rate of sand coming through the hourglass with intelligent coaching and intelligent programming and making sure we're doing what's best for our athletes. And so I think between the floor and the ceiling analogy and that hourglass, that's how I think about every season with every athlete that I work with. Am I trying to give you more sand, or are we in season? I'm trying to slow down the sand, because goodness knows you're going to get to championships, whether that's a collegiate championship or an Olympic event every quad, and you're going to have not a lot of sand left if you didn't plan well, right? You need to have a lot of sand left over to compete at your highest. And I think that's the error people make is they just kind of go for it. You know what I mean? They go for it every day. Scott, what do you want to share?
You go, Scott.
This is a super awesome conversation. And I think, we experienced it firsthand coming back from the initial COVID shutdown, in March, April, May. We used all kinds of different, papers. There was a paper on, I believe it was Achilles injuries in NFL, American football, coming back from a lockout that had happened in 2007 or 2008. And it showed this massive spike in Achilles injuries coming back from a lockout where the players weren't able to train as they normally do, and then they get thrown right into competition and boom. And we're kind of seeing that again in the NFL right now. If anyone's been paying attention to the injury rates, they're just crazy. I mean, my fantasy football team is out the window. Week 1, it was out the window basically. But anyway, yeah, exactly. The COVID reserve is real. But and we try to use those as education pieces for the club coaches in getting their athletes back. When they do get them back in the gym, there's going to be this temptation to just hammer down, because they're raring to go. They've been cooped up for a while. They haven't been able to train. The athletes are probably going to look fresh. They're going to be jumping super high, running fast because they're fresh. Like especially in gymnastics, they haven't been. There's very little off season. As like in terms of in the traditional model of training, it's basically train all the time.
Yeah.
There's no rest period. So when you get that 2 months of pretty low training loads, sure you're doing conditioning and you're doing your at-home stuff, but you're not the grind 4 or 5 hours, 6 days a week isn't there. So they come back and they're ready to go. Central nervous system wise, they're ready to go. So that's what the coaches see, and they're like, we went through. We actually used our workload stuff that we had been able to collect via questionnaires leading up to COVID and then at COVID, and then so we had sort of their previous ceiling, what they were doing to prepare for that national competition that would have happened in the end of March, and then what they were doing during the COVID shutdown and where those workloads were, somewhere in the 30% range overall of more general type training. And so we sort of tried our best to map out for each individual, how to get back to that upper level of training. What does a progressive, 8 to 12 week sort of ramp up look like? And we thought, we had generally thought that it would be easy to follow because there was no competition planned, right? Like there was nothing on the horizon. There was nothing at the 12-week mark. There was nothing at the 52-week mark, for that matter, actually scheduled. So we figured, and when I say we, it's sort of the IST with the sport. But sure enough, the coaches get the athletes back. They're looking good. Workloads, go up exponentially in the first 2 weeks. And then, by 6 weeks into return to training, we've got 75% of the team is training at some sort of limited capacity. And that's where it gets, it really hits home that, there's something to that. Obviously, there's something to this spike in workload. And the education and delivery that we were able to do was not effective on the whole. So I think that was definitely a humbling experience, and something that I can hopefully learn from, and that we'll all learn from. Now we're in a lot of Canada, we're back to a shutdown situation. They've closed a lot of places again, to try to, put a kind of chokehold on the next wave or whatever. But so, really, really hoping that we can get that message across again in a way that that coaches will really really identify with and want to follow.
Yeah, Tim, do you find that sometimes you try to map out a plan and it kind of goes in one ear out the other sometimes, or is that just a COVID thing?
Oh, look, there's different experiences with different coaches, I suppose.
Point.
Yeah, look, I think the plan is there as an idea, right? It gives you a bit of a map. But if you find that the athlete is tolerating the load really well, let's think about rehab, tolerating the load really well, then you might be able to be a little bit, I'm going to say, assertive rather than aggressive, but you can push a little harder.
Mm-hmm.
But then there might be other times where you think at this particular point in time the athlete should be further ahead, but the load that you give them is experiencing a lot of pain. They've still got a fear of movement, and for whatever reason, you might have to sort of sensibly regress load a little bit before you progress it.
Yeah.
So you're always, you have a plan in place, and it's based on the your best available evidence, and everyone's put some input into that program, but every plan is it's the best plan that you can come up with on paper.
Sure.
And then what you're trying to do then is you're just evaluating and adapting on the fly. So it's the best periodization model that you can come up with, and then you've just got to be really agile and flexible and adaptable with it, and you adapt that plan as you go based on the response of the athlete or the tissue to that load.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, my non at all evidence-based opinion on this is that I think the mistake that people make on the medical side is the tissue healing timelines and the response of like cartilage and collagen and bone that we know in a healthy body, when someone's not injured and doesn't have to work overtime to build new tissue. I think people recover between cyclical loading bouts a little bit faster, right? Like you're sore for a few days, you get some DOMs, or like you have some issues, but the net is fast, right? So I think a lot of times coaches are used to a quicker turnaround of an athlete who recovers all the way. I think that when you have an injury that's a little bit more limited by the tissue, the ligaments themselves, the bones themselves, especially like in stress fractures in young kids, there's a certain timeline that you could do everything in the world. You could sleep well, eat well, have a great training load. It still just takes like maybe 3 days to get a net collagen. I think we know from, Kyle Docking's work and some other that it's not a 12-hour turnaround here on like collagen remodeling, right? Like, so I think it's frustrating because there's no great answer. Medical providers want to have that golden answer or the special exercise or this great program that's going to make you feel better faster, but it's highly variable, right? Based on who recovers and builds new tissue. And then pain is extremely complex and extremely valuable too. So yeah, it's a tough area to talk about because there's not a lot of great research, but I think that people just, unfortunately, you have to go through maybe 50 loading cycles to get somebody all the way back to high levels of capacity. And it goes slower than some people want to, versus in the sports setting, when you have fresh athletes who are healthy, you can load them up and they bounce back pretty quick sometimes. And they can train when they're sore. They can train when they're a little tired, a little fatigued.
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind here is you can't cheat biological healing time. So if you have a fracture, roughly it's going to take you 6 weeks to get that to heal that injured tissue, and that's just to get it out of the cast. It might be 5 weeks, it might be 7 weeks, apart from probably an ankle sprain where we might be able to tape it up and send someone back. The reality is you just can't cheat it. It is what it is, and no matter, you can do whatever you can in terms of local tissue loading, and ideally you want to make sure that I use that rehab period to try and encourage my athletes to use it to get better at something.
Sure.
So if you've got an ACL and you can't run. Okay, well, we've noticed that you need to put a little bit of size on, muscle size. Let's use it as an opportunity to get stronger or to get bigger. So there's a little performance goal in there as well. But yeah, I mean, and you try your best to make sure that sport-specific capacity doesn't fall to the basement in that period where you have, you know, a long-term injury. But the injured, you just can't. There's not too many legal ways that you can fast track tissue healing. It is what it is, unfortunately.
Yep. Well said. And I guess kind of continuing on this topic is, I don't know, this season is really tough for people. It's kind of, and that's not a wash. People are going to compete, virtuals, whatever it is. Some version of competition will still happen. But between what I've seen across different sports and landscapes, and especially thinking about the Olympics being this summer, I feel as though there's going to be a lot of people who are going to like do the best they can through this next 6-month period. But a lot of people are going to be looking at, okay, how do I make drastic changes to the next quad after COVID clears, after we get past all this stuff? And so, Tim, if you're recommending someone who is looking at these concepts of floors and ceilings, what do people start with in terms of trying to plan the next maybe year after 2021? Because I think gymnastics is going to make a dramatic overhaul in the way they approach workloads after the Tokyo Olympics, because people are rightfully so gun shy right now. You don't want to make big sweeping changes in the end of a quad, but after the first start of a quad, people are going to be really open to new ideas. So I guess not just for gymnastics, but how do you start approaching what's my ceiling, what's my floor? How do you put some baselines around that, and how do you plan for that?
Well, in general, when I'm putting programs together, I look at three main things. I look at the demands of the activity, the demands of the sport. I look at the physical qualities that my athletes need to perform those demands, and then I just do a needs analysis with my individual athletes. So, and what happens then if you have an athlete who requires an aerobic base, he's strong but he doesn't have aerobic fitness, then that needs analysis tells us that perhaps more of his work is geared towards developing aerobic capacity, giving him a motor, making sure though that we don't overdo the aerobic work so that we train all the strength and train all the speed out of him, because then we've got to explain that to the coach. Hey, how did you make that match winner such a dud? he used to be a great athlete until you got your hands on him. Yeah, so then we go, you look at that, it raises the physical qualities across the board, and then by raising the physical qualities, it helps you perform the demands of the sport. Now, those demands of the sport are like a moving target too, because sports change their rules all the time, which change the demands. So you've got to keep reevaluating the demands. But that's typically the process that I'd go through in terms of developing a program. But that's kind of short to medium term goals. You still have to have, I like to have a long term plan to look at, okay, let's have a look at a snapshot of the annual plan. What does that look like? Where is our emphasis of training going to be? Where are we going to develop strength or emphasize strength over aerobic, over speed? Where are we going to get our skill work in? Where are our major events that we need to make sure that we're really firing, and where are other activities that could be major events for that athlete's life? For example, academic exam periods where there's going to be academic stress. So are we factoring in that as well? Mm. Then you've got your annual plan. You're overlaying that over four of those annual plans, and you can see them kind of joining up across that 4-year period. The last point there is that you have to be quite adaptable with that plan, though, because if we think that yes, the training stress is going to be a really big rock in terms of producing some sort of adaptation, without a doubt, that's going to be an important part of it. But adaptation is also going to be influenced by other factors like other stresses. So if you don't consider those other stresses, at the start, and then don't adjust your program when they inevitably come. Life just throws different stresses at people. Then you're not really, if you're just rigidly sticking to the plan, you're not really giving the athlete the best chance of a positive adaptation. So you're going to have to be pretty adaptable and flexible for when those moments come, that there's going to be some times where you have to pull back on the training stress, or you're going to have to push forward on the recovery. So you're like just trying to pull and push on different levers as you need to ensure that you, even though you've got a plan, you're adjusting that plan as need be, so that when you get to those key moments when they have to perform, you're giving them the best chance to get there in the best shape possible.
Yep. Yeah, very well said. Scott, what are your thoughts? How do you approach, with you and your team of coaches and other medical providers or other strength coaches, how do you approach talking with the athlete and planning for a year ahead and then a full year ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I could take this in a few different directions, I think. I think if this year's taught me anything, it's that you need a plan, but you can't be married to that plan. And I think that's what Tim was just kind of going over. Like, and over the last 3 or 4 years with softball, and then the last 8 years with Ellie, I think what I've tried to really do is I've tried to look for things that work really well for individual athletes. Whether that's a speed, like a speed-based phase, or a power-based phase, or a strength-based phase. Not everybody's gonna respond well from a physiological standpoint, or from a peaking standpoint to the same type of stimulus. And I think 8 or 10 years ago, I was really married to this sort of either linear or like multilinear type of a periodization scheme, where I would just kind of go through the same thing with everybody. And I think that's key to do. And with younger and less experienced athletes, I think that's fine. You go through a few years of that, and I think they're going to continue to get better. They're going to continue to get bigger, faster, stronger, whatever the goal is. But eventually, when you get to the level of athletes who have trained consistently and with a good program for the last 4 or 5 years, then you start to look at what really works well for them. And I think that's been really the key reason why I've liked monitoring, and why I've liked to keep tabs on whether it's vertical jump scores on a multi-times a week basis from almost everyone that I work with, whether that's wellness scores from questionnaires with, again, almost everybody that I work with, because I really want to figure out what works for individuals and apply that when it's needed. So that's kind of what I try to now start off the season with a bit of a debrief of the previous season for athletes and coaches, of course, but when it comes down to the athlete level, because that's kind of what you asked me about, start off talking to them about the end and what the end's going to look like, because those initial, with some of the sports that have really long off seasons, those initial few months of general preparation type training can get really monotonous and get really, the athletes aren't feeling snappy, they're not feeling fast, and they want to feel fast all the time. Athletes always want to do that. We talked a little bit about this on our last podcast, putting in that work to get to the point where you actually do the stuff that is going to be directly applicable to your sport. And I think that I like to try to lay that stuff out, and when in the year is that going to happen, so that athletes have something or have that to look forward to. Show them why I now feel like this is appropriate for them, with some information, depending on the athlete, the level of complexity that I would go to, I guess. But, say, okay, leading up to your premier event for this year, starting 6 weeks out, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to approach that stuff. And I think that that's been really, really helpful in getting buy-in with the athletes and getting them through those long off-season kind of phases. I don't know if that answered your question or not, Dave.
No, very well, actually. Yeah. And I want to go back to this. It just sparked my brain, but I want to go back to Tim, when you were talking about the most demanding passage of play, because I feel as though that very much in one respect represents what their ceiling is going to be down the road, right? To either operate on a high level playing field or be able to do things. A question I wanted to ask you that I never got to is, when you plan for the most demanding passage of play, do you sometimes plan for the most demanding passage of play like within like a single game or competition, or do you also plan for like the most demanding like training block they're going to have? Because in my world, when I was trying to apply those concepts, I was thinking about the local physiological things they need of max anaerobic power or whatever, like a very specific competitive event may be. But I'm also in my mind thinking about, Well, they also have to tolerate 4.5-hour practices 5 days per week. And then they also have to tolerate a 5 to 7 day national training camp, which is pretty arduous. And then in the macro period, I think, most people are training for a regional or a national event, which is oftentimes 3 days of back-to-back competition. It's not always one single thing. So I don't know. I've never really asked that, but do you plan for the specific most demanding passages of play, like we talked about in rugby in your example, or is it also you're trying to think about globally? If it's a 3-day event, I have to get somebody ready for, do I have to prepare that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of answers to this. Let's go to the first part in terms of preparing for, a big training camp. It's going to be a 7-day training camp where training loads are going to be much greater than anything they experience on an average week. What I'm hoping to prepare for there is to develop a large enough chronic load to allow them to deal with the inevitable spike that's going to come with that training camp. If we can't change the coach's view on what they need to fit into that training camp, then the spike is going to come. So it may be unrealistic if let's say we've got 10,000 units of load in the training camp and our average week is 4,000 units of load, it may be unrealistic to build an adequate chronic load to bridge the gap between where they are and where they need to be. So, and the reality is we may never get to enough training on a week-to-week basis to do that. But what we try and focus on there is if we can get consistency in our training through developing our chronic load, but get consistency, and we're trying to expand the glass as much as possible so that our chronic load is expanding over time. It's not going to take days or weeks. It'll take months and probably years to expand that glass. But we're also developing physical qualities that put us in a better position to cope with that spike. And that's when we're talking about the moderators of load tolerance, that a similar spike in load can mean different things for two different athletes. If you have an athlete with no physical qualities, then that spike in load is going to be far more stressful than someone who has well-developed physical qualities. So we're just the consistency you get in your training and the development of the physical qualities helps you deal with that spike. Now, in terms of preparing for the most demanding passage of play, there's absolutely no research that's been done that looks at the risk of injury in relation to the most demanding passage of play. So when I talk about if you train for the average demands, it's likely you'll be underprepared for the most demanding passage of play. All I'm talking about is simply from the performance viewpoint. That at best, if you train for the average demands, you're going to be really well prepared for what happens below the average demands of competition. And if you think about team sports, if you think about football or basketball, that's the time when you get scored against and you're walking back to start the game again. You'll be well prepared for that because it'll be happening all the time. Now, what you want to be prepared for is what happens at these most demanding passages of play, because they're really closely tied to those scoring moments. They tend to happen in really close proximity to goals or points being scored or conceded, or shots on goal. So your ability or inability to do them could prove critical to the outcome of the game. So in terms of being prepared for that most demanding passage of play, it's purely, I'm coming at it purely from a performance angle, making sure that you've been exposed to it often enough in training. And I'm not talking about spending 99% of your training time on something that happens, 1 or 2% of the game, but just making sure that you've been there often enough that when you need to go to that dark place in the game, you've been there before.
Yeah, and Scott, kind of on the same wavelength there, is when you have someone who's trying to reach multiple levels above their current state of preparedness or strength or power or things of that nature. how are you safely exposing someone to much harder training and not risking something going wrong? But I can definitely say from the medical side, we have a comfortable tolerance of pain to guide us, right? It's a pretty easy way to do it. But in your world, you don't really have a ton of that. You can't just like throw really hard sessions to try to build someone for that really demanding time and hope it goes well. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, from a strength and conditioning standpoint, I really feel like our role is a support role to the actual sport, right? So we're there to build up these capacities to act as moderators for, hopefully injury reduction or injury kind of reduction of incidents. We're there to build capacity so that every effort that they make is at a slightly lower percent of maximal, all of those types of things. So I really think that I have to err on the side of caution. I mean, I don't ever want, and it has happened to me, and so I've tried to learn from these experiences and these situations, but I don't ever want a player missing time on the field or in the boat or on the floor because of something that I did, and me going too hard or pushing too fast in the weight room. So, I definitely feel like I need to err on the side of caution and safely, progressively overload the system, the tissue, the athlete. And that's really where I guess I kind of see that answer for sure.
Yeah, I think that's buttoned up very, very well. I'd like to selfishly shift the conversation a little bit to gymnastics stuff, just because this is something that Scott and I are both, avidly working on now. And I think this is how Tim and this whole conversation is coming together well. Tim and I first connected because we were trying to find a way to measure things in gymnastics that I don't think it really exists yet, right? It's such a complex sport and we don't understand what's happening. But the first research project that I was working on pre-COVID with a couple Division I schools and a couple other researchers was trying to find what normal is, right? Trying to find normative data. How hard is gymnastics across a college season? How hard is NCAA championships or seasons, things like that? And so I'd like to just talk a little bit about maybe where we see the future of the sport going, because Scott and I invested. But Tim, the first question is, I think gymnastics, as you and I talked about, and we've kind of had these conversations before, but how do you, it's very hard to measure gymnastics or wrestling, for example, or other things that are not, there's not a set miles per hour to measure. There's not a set number of throws like in baseball. What are your recommendations to people who are working in more of these kind of mixed sports? How would you suggest people start to go about their measuring techniques in that?
Yeah, look, I guess it's a tough one in terms of, well, firstly, what do you think are the most important things that you want to measure? Is it the athlete's perception of how hard the load is, and then their response to that load, or do you feel that you need to get better information in terms of external load? Now, if you think external load is important, the actual work that they've performed, then I think in time, the way microsensors are evolving, when they first came out, they were quite large and bulky, but they're so small now. You could fit a small microsensor that has a gyroscope and triaxial accelerometer and probably a magnetometer as well, a little 10-cent piece on the small of the athlete's back, on their lower back. So it's so small that they wouldn't even notice it. And that is probably where you'll get to in terms of quantifying external load. But that in itself won't be enough. I think you still need to look at, well, what is the response to load? And then, is my athlete coping with the load? And if you have those three steps at a minimum, then you're completing the athlete monitoring cycle. You're knowing what they're doing, you're knowing how they're responding, and then thirdly, how they're coping with the load. And I think that's, if you wanted to add one last thing, you could do something like Scott does with whether it be a counter movement jump or whether it be some sort of physical readiness to train and perform again. But that'd be kind of the approach that I'd go down. But equally, I'd be thinking, what is my question first? What do I actually want to know?
Yep.
And then what is the least amount of information that I need in order to do my job well? Because like any sport, gymnastics will be a can of worms when you open it up and you go, well, I can do this, or I could do that, or I can do this. So the thing I always have to remind myself is what is the least amount of information I need.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, super well said. And I kind of share, and I definitely want to hear from Scott too, because he's actively working on this too. But there's gonna be a lot of people who listen to this podcast that are working on very high level gymnastics, whether it's college or university or within different countries. So what I have found useful, and this is through Tim's help and many other people, a lot of painful trial and error, is just a basic, sleep quality, mood, soreness, and readiness, energy levels, and getting a wellness score from that was massively valuable to me to just get a marker on how are you feeling, right? How are you feeling the next day after training load? But whether you measure a single session RPE, but I think that the work we're seeing now is split event RPEs of measuring each individual event by itself, along with strength conditioning, and saying how hard was just bars, how hard was just vault, how hard was just floor, how hard was your physical preparation or your conditioning work. That's been extremely helpful for us to parse out what is taxing the athlete the most. And that's not purely external, right? That's a mixed internal perception of how they feel. If you could get a wellness score and then a split RPE, and then in an ideal world, what we're trying to install now is an accelerometer and like the tibial plateau, or the tibial shaft or something like that, like they can wear, or a gyroscope. Those three numbers together, man, if you could get 6 months of data on those three things alone, that'd be like a gold mine, like a total treasure trove, right? And so that's what Scott and I are slowly trying to start doing. But that's my user example. And are there any things that you think, Tim, are also like nuances to that? Like people might interpret that data or say like those numbers are you shouldn't change your plan too much based on those numbers, or are those things pretty accurate in terms of like sleep and soreness and stuff like that? Sorry.
Yeah, look. I think we've spoken a little bit about your approach with. I think you had an event specific RPE, but you're also weighting them. I think at different, depending on what they were doing. So I think that's a really cool modification of an RPE. And it there won't be any research to show you that that's the way to go. But I'm looking at that thing, and that's a really practical approach. Look, I think if you can do that with your response variables, then those two things alone are going to be pretty valuable. Keeping in mind that you're going to get very different RPEs for different athletes, which is normal. So what I typically do is I don't actually compare athlete to athlete. I just compare one athlete with themselves. And I guess the other thing to keep in mind with the response is just because someone has one poor night of sleep and there's a link between sleep and injury doesn't mean that you shut that athlete down. Just you might just be aware of it, and it might be, okay, we're in a heavy training block. This is something that we're going to try and push through. Other times you might pull back depending on where they are in the cycle and where they are in relation to competition. So one poor measurement doesn't mean you shut things down. Typically with the response variables, I will that well-being is I will look at a rolling score relative to where they are at any given point in time. So if they've rated high relative to their normal, then we just keep on training. If they're rating low, well, we need to interpret that in context to the plan. Well, we're in the middle of a heavy trainer block. We expect them to be we expect them to be sore and tired and moody. That's normal, So and then looking at those individual scores actually helps a bit, because sometimes you can be rating average, but actually you're sleeping really well, so that's above average, but your soreness is below average. Or so you just have to keep an eye on individual constructs of your well-being as well.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that. I think that athlete versus themselves and not athlete versus each other is the most important thing to pull out of that, because it's so easy to look across the broad, paint all the athletes by the same brush or so and speak, but everyone's got different lives, different injuries, different, especially in gymnastics, different events, things like that. And before I pass the torch to Scott to share more, I know I'm going to get emails about this, but the way we measure it is the weighting factors are 1 through 4 based on the intensity of that they're doing in their gymnastics practice. So basics are obviously very not that strenuous, right? But like half routines versus full routines versus a full competition are very different zones of stress physiologically on the athlete. So there's more of a weighting factor based on that. And the coach prescribes that based on what they obviously train for the day. So it's the time on the event in minutes multiplied by the athlete's rate of perceived exertion for that event multiplied by the weighting factor. Say you're doing full routines on 2 events and half routines on the other routines, you can understand the different nuances there, and you can parse out specifically floor is the most taxing thing for this athlete. So that's the work we're doing on it. And it's all published. Most of it's published online. We've shared most of it before. So if you're curious about that, you can find it. But Scott, what are your thoughts? What do you think in terms of where the sport is going and practically ways that we can give people advice?
I think all the stuff we've talked about in the last hour, but the last 10 minutes or so is really, really practical advice. I think if you can gather, some really basic information around how much work the athlete's doing, how hard that is, how they're feeling, through questions or responses to questions like you've laid out, sleep, mood, wellness, energy levels, all those types of things. And then you can, at the very least, or try to get some type of performance metric. I find really, really helpful to figure out what that is. So maybe for gymnastics, like I used to do a lot of timed vault approaches. So sort of 5-meter flies at the end of a vault approach to kind of be a practical in-house way of monitoring athlete readiness. Now, that's not super practical for everyone. Not everybody has 2 sets of timing gates or whatever. But something as simple as a vertical jump that you can collect with something like the My Jump app or something along those lines can be a really easy way to go as a coach if that's what you have access to. But I think we're on really similar pages, Dave, in terms of the stuff that we're starting to collect. Between those session RPEs, event-specific session RPEs, wellness questionnaires, trying to use, individual trends as the mark of, is it a high or low value? Because just like you guys are saying, athletes, you can have one athlete who's going to answer 3 out of 10 for everything, and that's baseline. You have another athlete that's 9 out of 10 for everything, and that's their baseline. So, a 10 is an incremental jump for that athlete, whereas like a 5 for the first athlete is actually a huge jump and is a really good day if we're looking at rating is from 1 to 10. So it's really important not to compare athletes to each other with that sort of stuff and compare their own trends and look for anomalies there. I think those are the key factors. And I'm hoping that through these connections on this podcast and others that we might come up with, myself with a colleague through Dalhousie University in Halifax have attempted to start a research project last fall going into using inertial measurement units to track external load for gymnastic events. And I really like what Tim said. It really hit home in terms of what's the least amount of information that I need, because I think the mistake we made was we went too far and we got bogged down a little bit with some of the logistics around, what's a low, moderate, high level skill on different events. And that's what really that was one of the factors that stopped us from completing the study. And then, the final factor was March 2020 happening. So we didn't get to go any further there. But I think that, that's going to come for sure. I mean, you're just like you said, accelerometers or inertial measurement units are getting smaller and smaller, and they're getting easier and easier, more plug and play. And I think that, really understanding how much impact or how many impacts, I think that maybe is what it ends up boiling down to, number and intensity of impact, and how an athlete can deal with that, how you can build those slowly over a period of time to build up that tissue resilience and build up that sort of injury resilience factor, if that's a thing, to try to keep athletes healthy. Because of the other piece with gymnastics that you guys know is that athletes are lasting a lot longer in the sport, especially on the female side. Males, it had been for a while, but I'm currently dealing with a 25-year-old gymnast, and then the rest, the average of the Canadian team that'll probably go now. Obviously, I don't have anything to do with athlete selection or anything along those lines, but if I was to guess, it's going to be over 20, the average of the 4 or 5 gymnasts that go to Tokyo, and that's crazy compared to even 8 years ago. The average would have been 16, right? So that's where the sport's going. And, we're going to have to figure out ways to keep those athletes healthy so that they can actually compete and they can actually train on a regular basis without, 75% of their year being made up of rehab. Because that's how you're going to push the envelope on the events. You're going to push the difficulty when you can train them repeatedly without getting hurt. And I think that's these types of things that we're talking about here is a huge step in that direction of making that happen.
Yeah, I have to. I was laughing as you were going, not because I was laughing what you're saying, but I have a funny story of when I was first working with Tim and chatting about some stuff. Is we had the mood comments for a bunch of the teenagers I was pilot testing on, and one girl would just put the same smiley face in every single mood box for like 6 weeks in a row. One day she put a flat face. It was a dot and a flat. It wasn't a frown, but it was a flat face. And I was like, whoa, what's going on here? Something's tragic is going on in Julia's life. But just talking about the minimal difference. But I agree in terms of the age going later, which is great to see. Something that's really interesting that too, to kind of say this and we'll wrap up, is by the ability to have a easy to use plug and play metric for whatever sport you're working in is, I think, is the universal gap builder between rehab and starting of training, right? If I know as a medical provider and I can use accelerometers or I can use impact sensors and I can measure how many high impact loads they're taking and how much their cumulative impact scores, I know their starting point for getting back into rehab. I can give them a dosage of training that's going to be mimicked, similar with like sprinting volume, right? If I can track somehow how much time you've spent in high speed running and what that looks like, I know where to start you maybe in terms of mileage or percentage of time in high speed running when I send you back to baseball or whatever it is. So I would highly encourage people to investigate what's applicable in their sport and then try to do it. And if you can get, I'm crossing my fingers that this podcast goes out to some tech companies and they're willing to let us use it for a research project. But I would love to just get baseline data on what happens to a gymnast when they land on 3 different surfaces of tumble track and floor and hard surfaces. And like, okay, here are our numbers, right? And then now I can know in the rehab setting, when I do box jumps or plyos, that it's like, well, this is kind of a similar force. And so we can use that as a way to, again, dose tissue specific load capacity for Achilles or backs or things of that nature. So I don't know where that comment was going, but that just popped into my head. So I wanted to share that. But Tim, do you have anything else?
We probably have some of those, Dave. We probably have some of that stuff, man. We're going to start sharing it soon.
I know, right? It's going to be a think tank, a global think tank. But yeah, Tim, is there anything else on your mind that you think is important to note here, or things that are kind of popping up in the research you want to maybe give a heads up to?
Look, we've covered so many topics. I think I'm just about fried. I'm keeping notes. I've been making notes on what Scott's been saying and what both of you have been saying actually. So it's been a really enjoyable podcast. We've covered a lot of pretty cool stuff, and isn't it going to be great when it goes out to those tech companies and they just start throwing all this these accelerometers, wearable technologies at us and say, yeah, try us, use ours.
I make the joke that I have academic ADD on podcasts sometimes because there's so many things that I want to get to in the course of an hour that I like jump all over the place. But no, it's good. I think we did a good job of covering maybe the nuanced areas that people are a little bit, I mean, they're probably thinking about, but there's not data to catch up with it, like, Scott had said. So I think that does it, guys. I think we crushed that one. So Tim, I have to say, I want to give you the plug because your course is now online and I was looking at it and I highly suggest that in the COVID world that people who are like, I need some extra, things to do and stuff. I mean, your course was one of the most helpful courses I've ever taken because I'd had a background, but like, it was not what I expected it to be in a good way. I came in preconceived notion that's going to be like data geek Excel stuff. And we had some amazing conversations around more than just the data. So I want to make sure we give a plug for that. Where can people find the course or when's it coming out? This is going to be released in a couple of weeks. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. It's a lot of work. I probably underestimated how much work, but the final product is I'm really proud of. I'm really happy with. If people are interested in it, there's I think 15 hours of content plus another 10 plus hours of practical hands-on activities. They can go straight to our website, gabbettperformance.com. Just follow the links, and it's on demand, so they can view it at their own pace, study at their own pace. They can go back over stuff and watch it again. And there's all sorts of quizzes and practical activities to kind of test their understanding of concepts. So thanks. I appreciate the fact that you enjoyed the live one. I'm still going to do the live face-to-face one because getting out and talking to people is, I wouldn't have met you, and as a result, I wouldn't have met Scott either. So, and we have that common friend in Jeremy Shepherd as well. So, it's such a small world, and I really enjoy. I really appreciate the people I've met and probably this year more than ever has made me appreciate the things I do have, rather than, COVID's taken some things, but it's really made me appreciate what I do have. So, yeah.
You'll have to host a virtual beer after the course. So that was the best part, was just talking not about workloads and just catching up with you as it is. So you have to have like a Zoom session. Maybe
that's what I'll do next is a join the virtual beer session where we can have a conversation. It doesn't have to be anything about data or research, whatever. It's just someone poses the topic and then we have a conversation about it.
I'm down. Let's start it. We'll have an academic online Zoom beer night. I'm down.
Yeah, sounds good.
Scott, anything from you, man? Where can people find you, or if they want to contact you? Because I'm sure they'll have some follow-up questions. Where can they blow up your social media and Twitter?
Yeah, social media, both Instagram and Twitter are SDub Strength, SDub Strength, so SDUB Strength. And then, I work at the Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So, you can find us online at cscatlantic.ca. You can find my contact information there. My email is easy. It's just scott@cscatlantic.ca. So, yeah, pretty easy.
Prepare for the flood. I'm just warning you. Wait for the inbox to explode. Well,
you know what, Dave? Since our last podcast, I've probably had 8 or 9 gymnastics coaches from around mostly North America, but also a couple in Europe, reach out to just discuss their programming thoughts and what they've started doing, which is amazing. Like I had no idea how, at the grassroots level, how many club coaches have this huge interest in strength and conditioning and are starting to dabble in it, but maybe don't have a formal training or have just done maybe some CrossFit or something along those lines. Yeah. So don't know how to sequence things or don't necessarily know where to start. And I'm so appreciative of you giving me this platform, because that's one of the things that we talked about this last time too, hoping to be able to do is kind of start something within the gymnastics community, not just locally, but as far reaching as we can for the betterment of the sport and the athletes that are involved in the sport. So I think this is massive. And again, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear that, man. That warms my heart, because I feel like people desperately just want information and help right now. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of great mediums that connect people like this. And I firmly believe that, science-based strength conditioning and workload and wellness stuff is the solution to many of the cultural problems we have. And I think this is why I continue to do the podcast and why I try to talk with you and Tim, is because having good strength conditioning, good workloads and wellness programs is very much how we're going to get out of this mess that we're in terms of some had a really poor experience. So I'm super grateful that I just have the ability that people even care about it and listen to the podcast. And I'm just connecting people, man. I'm not the star of the show. So that does it for now, though. But thank you guys so much for joining me. I appreciate all of your time and your expertise and your guidance, Tim, especially. I can't thank you enough for all your help in the last few years getting all this stuff together. But we'll get this chopped up and we'll put it out probably in a couple of weeks.
Thanks.
All right. Have a good night, guys. Have a good day.